Okay, hello and welcome everyone. We're still got a couple minutes till we get going, but I wanted to say hello and greet you all and sort of start to introduce the session and just get a sense of who's here. So we'll do an official start to the session in a couple minutes, but I'd be curious, I've been told I can do some yes-no poll questions just to start understanding who's here. So I'd be curious to hear how many people in the audience right now are students? And so what you would do is I think you hit the hand raise function to let me know if you're a student. I'll give you 10 seconds to answer that. Okay, so hopefully that was enough time. So we've got about at least a quarter of the audience who's answering, students. How about postdocs in the audience? Okay, so we've got another 10%, it looks like. And anyone else in academia not covered by those two categories? Oh, it's jumping up and down. All right, I see about 13%. And people in industry. So we've got actually a fairly even split, which is nice. All right, about 12% there. And government. Oh, that's too bad. There's no one in government, or maybe you're just not voting. Oh, there we go. All right, at least one or two people. So I'm sure those numbers did not sum to 100%, but thank you for those of us who are joining. It's nice to see that we do have a mix across the sectors. So this session is going to be a little bit different from a lot of the others. We're going to start with a couple longer talks. So I've called this session a thematic keynote, because the intention is we only have two speakers. They're going to have a longer time to present each, but then I really would like this to become a conversation and a discussion afterwards. So I'm just looking at the number of people in the room. Right now, we are under the magic number of 30 that I was told. If you use the group chat for your questions, we will all be able to see them. So I'd say let's go ahead and do that. You're welcome if you'd like to ask separately. If you don't want to use the chat, you're welcome to use the ask button, and that will go to the moderator, and that can still be copied over to me, and I can either ask it anonymously for you, or we can display that on the screen. But in the interest of trying to keep this a little bit less formal, let's try and recreate that community feel that we're missing in the online environment. If you want to use the group chat throughout the presentations, please feel free to do so. The presentation is going to be 20 to 25 minutes each, and then I'm hoping to leave a good chunk of time at the end for broader conversation. And so this is a session I've been really interested in having for a long time. And this is thinking about some of these really large-scale tools that are often used in sustainable systems research, but are often unwieldy and kind of intimidating for many researchers in this area as well. And so we have two presentations. The first one, we're going to be talking about macro energy modeling efforts and these energy system models, and in particular insights from the Open Energy Outlook. And that's going to be presented by Aranya Venkatesh. I'll give a brief introduction to her and her bio in a moment. And then we have the second talk that's going to be about integrated assessment modeling, IAMs, which is going to be presented by Paul Kishimoto, focused on the message globiome family of integrated assessment models. It's going to be a broad overview of what they're attempting to do and what are the strategies that we need as a community to better leverage these models. And then we'd like you to think about, we're going to be asking you, well, have you tried to use these models? And what challenges did you come up against? Or how do you see we as a community, as the sustainable systems community, can make better use of these models? All right, so keep those in mind. And as always, please use the chat for questions or comments. As I said, I'd really like this to be an interactive experience, as challenging as that is online. So with all of that said, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Aranya Venkatesh is a research scientist in the Engineering and Public Policy Department at Carnegie Mellon, working primarily on the Open Energy Outlook project to examine decarbonization pathways for U.S. energy sectors. Her research interests are focused on modeling energy infrastructure development and the environmental and policy implications of energy utilization decisions. She has a background in systems modeling, optimization, and data analysis for energy technology and environmental assessment, with over 8 years of research experience in industry, government, and academia. I believe it's going to be a recording, and I'll let Aranya sort of introduce the recording briefly, and she'll be around to answer questions as well.
Thanks, Daniel, for the introduction, and hi, everyone. As Daniel mentioned, I do have a pre-recorded talk that is going to be displayed up in a second, but if you have questions sort of along the way, feel free to use the chat option, so I'm happy to answer those during the recorded talk if you need. And then also looking forward to a really good discussion at the end of it. So this is an ongoing project. We've been working at it for about a year or so at this point. There's lots of work to be done. So we're really looking for feedback from researchers in the community, folks who might be able to contribute to the modeling effort, as well as who might be able to use some of the tools we're developing. So yeah, looking forward to the discussion today. Hello, everyone. I'm Aranya Venkatesh, a research scientist at Carnegie Mellon, and the technical lead on the Open Energy Outlook project that I'll be talking about today. The OEO is a collaborative open source macro energy modeling effort for the United States. And I'm presenting on behalf of a core team that's split between NC State and CMU, as well as a larger project team that I'll talk about shortly. For some context about macro energy models, as summarized in a 2019 paper by Patricia Levy and colleagues, these are large-scale systems-level models used to understand and evaluate long-term aspects of sustainable energy planning. Specifically, energy economy optimization models are often used to understand the dynamics of future energy system transitions, as seen in some of these highly visible analyses for specific countries or for regions. Models like NEMS or Markel times have been used in analysis for the UK, the US, and Ireland, for example. While the World Energy Model is used by the IEA in developing the World Energy Outlook. These models are typically characterized by multi-decadal timescales, for example, looking out to 2050 or 2100. They have pretty expansive system boundaries. So for example, just considering the electric sector within a region, or considering multiple energy sectors like buildings, transport, and industry within a country. They're often multidisciplinary, drawing from different domains such as engineering, economics, or environmental science. And they're typically used to address research questions relating to decarbonization pathways, technology costs, and thinking about the impacts of any proposed policies, as well as decisions under future uncertainty. So where the Open Energy Outlook project fits in. In the OEO, we're examining technology and policy pathways to achieve deep decarbonization in the US using macro energy systems modeling. Our goal is to apply best available practices to maximize transparency, build a network community, all working towards a common goal, which is examining different US energy futures that can inform energy and climate policy efforts. The project is highly collaborative. So besides the core team that I mentioned earlier, we have a project team of about 35 members spread across several universities, research institutions, and national labs who guide the project. We also use open source tools and data as part of our modeling effort. Here are some of the types of questions that we're looking to answer as part of this effort. So for example, how can we design deep decarbonization policies that are robust to future uncertainty? What are some of the technology pathways that are critical when thinking about achieving low emissions across different scenarios? Or what are the costs and environmental implications of different policy approaches? Central to our effort is the open source TEMOA model. So TEMOA is similar to several other energy system optimization models such as Markel times and osmosis. They're all set up as linear programming models, where the objective is to minimize the present costs of energy supply over the entire model time horizon. So key decision variables could include installed capacity of new energy infrastructure, as well as energy flows between regions or between energy sectors. Our entire modeling platform is primarily built using Python. So we use Pyomo, which is a Python-based open source optimization modeling language. And to that, we connect different solvers like Cplex and Gurobi to actually solve the model. And we use SQLite to store our input and output data. And while Temoa is a flexible modeling platform, we're developing an input database specifically for the OEO that's focused in the US. So our modeling horizon extends out to 2050, while our system boundary includes the industry, transport, building, and electric sectors within the US. We disaggregate the US into 9 regions, considering heterogeneity in energy demands, resource availability, technology costs, as well as climate. And all of these regions are connected to each other, for example, through electric transmission or fuel transport infrastructure networks. And then using Temoa, these are the types of model results that we can expect to see. So for example, for a very specific low carbon policy scenario, here's a mix of fuels that will likely be used to meet demands across the different energy sectors. There are several challenges associated with these type of modeling efforts, definitely not unique to the Open Energy Outlook project. One such set of challenges is in thinking about trade-offs between model scale and complexity. So for example, what energy sectors do we consider within our modeling framework and at what resolution? Do we consider the electric sector only and treat demands from other sectors as exogenous inputs? And even within the power sector, do we consider several hundred individual power plants, or can we cluster them in some way? Similarly, we need to ask questions about the spatial extent of our analysis. Should we disaggregate rural and urban energy demands? Also thinking about temporal resolution. So when considering decadal timescales, how do we account for hourly or sub-hourly variability in things like renewable energy supply as well as energy demand? And how do we account for climate and environmental feedbacks when using representations of the energy system only? So these questions are relevant to many disciplines and methods that are working sort of within sustainable energy systems research. And just like in those areas, these decisions should be driven by the research question that we're really trying to answer. Another point to note is that these models aren't considered in isolation. They typically live within a larger ecosystem of models. So for example, within the OEO using Temoa, we have a pretty coarse representation of the electric sector compared to power systems models. So we would like to validate some of our insights from Temoa by linking our work with more detailed models that do capacity expansion or economic dispatch for the power sector. Similarly, our scenario analysis will likely be driven by results from integrated assessment models that have projections for emissions trajectories that may be required to meet various climate goals. And we argue that in this type of framework, you need to pay attention to the modeling process as well. Inputs to energy systems models are very uncertain, but the decisions that these tools can be used to inform are critical. And this really motivated our decision to not only use open source models and tools, but also use open source publicly available data. In addition, we're developing detailed documentation for both the models as well as the data, which we think can help engage the broader peer community and help us get expert insights. We also have a toolbox of methods that can be used to evaluate model outcomes under uncertainty that I'll talk about later. And here's some more motivation for us to make our effort more transparent, accessible, and collaborative. So here on the right is a snapshot of a network diagram that represents a single region within our database. You'll remember that it looks similar to the network diagram that I showed earlier, which was illustrative. I'll point out that we consider 9 regions within the OEO framework, and this is a snapshot of just a single region. So we include nearly 3,000 distinct energy demands across the buildings, transport, and industrial sectors. And in order to meet these demands, we model over 30,000 individual processes that represent things like light and heavy duty vehicle technologies, power plants, or hydrogen compression. Several of these processes are specified by cost and performance characteristics that can be quite uncertain or could be changing rapidly. So in our case, documentation becomes critically important when we're trying to share information, either sort of within our core team, within our broader project team, as well as part of the peer community. So in the slides that follow, I'll discuss some of the approaches that we've taken to address some of these challenges. And one caveat I note here is that the open source and collaborative approaches that we've used are not new. They're in fact derived from well-established practices in other domains and disciplines. And we think there's room to grow and improve. So we welcome any feedback from folks here, as well as from the broader scientific community as part of our modeling effort. So we're leveraging an ecosystem of available open source tools within the Open Energy Outlook. We think this can help with transparency and repeatability of our analysis. For example, we use Power Genome, which is an open source tool that creates input data sets for power system capacity expansion models. Power Genome has been developed by Greg Shively, along with a team of researchers at Princeton University and elsewhere. So from this tool, we can create electric sector data sets that can be used by TOMOA. So these include generator characteristics like efficiency and ramp rates, existing generator capacity, transmission capacity and losses, any investment and operations costs associated with these different technologies, as well as capacity factors and resource constraints that represent variable renewable energy like wind and solar. And in addition to using open source data, we're also rigorously trying to document how we collect and parse the data that we use to create these input data sets. We believe that providing open source data sets and documentation can better engage domain experts in the peer community. So to that end, we've developed a separate GitHub repo that hosts our input data and documentation. We've used Jupyter Notebooks, which is an open source web application that pretty seamlessly combines text and code to present documentation for our input data. And we've also connected our GitHub repo to Binder, which is an open source service that can make a GitHub repo interactive. So this means that users who want to interact with the data, don't have this additional barrier of having to clone a repo, set up a Conda environment, and then run the Jupyter Notebooks locally. So in the next slide, I present a short demo of what our setup looks like. So here's a snapshot of our OEO GitHub repo that includes preliminary databases that we're working on, as well as documentation. So this is the documentation directory that includes several Jupyter notebooks that focus on different energy sectors that we include. So buildings, electricity, and transport. And here's a link to Binder, which users can connect to and have Binder open a remote instance of the entire repository. So there's no need to actually clone the repo at all. So using this interface, you can navigate to any one of the documentation notebooks and kind of open it up remotely. So for example, here we're taking a look at the electric sector notebook. You can see that there's ability to embed a table of contents here, as well as look at documentation that's in markdown cells. You can also interact with the input data using these widgets that we've developed. So here we're looking at, for example, investment costs for specific electric technologies. You can select a specific technology to look at, as well as a region that we're using within our database. And you can choose to either look at the data as a figure or a table. And if you have interest, there's also ability to actually go in and modify the code that develops these widgets. So you could use that to maybe, modify some of these widgets or develop new widgets, depending on your need. And then we also have some other widgets that make it quite useful as you're exploring the input database. So here, for example, this is a quick technology or commodity description lookup tool. You can type in any keyword of interest and it pulls up kind of the associated commodities and technologies within the database. Here we have a network diagram lookup tool. So you can specify, specific technology to look at. So here we're looking at the network diagram for bioenergy with CCS. You can hover over the individual nodes to tell you what, and that gives you a description of what those specific technologies or commodities are. Or you could also use this lookup tool that we've developed to kind of get a description of what some of these short codes stand for when looking up technologies and commodities within our input database. So these are just several ways in which you can interact with some of these input data sets that we're putting together through Jupyter Notebooks and through Binder, and hopefully making it a lot more accessible than looking at a whole bunch of Excel or CSV files. And then we know that we may have several experts and users who may not want to use our modeling platform, where you need to install a Conda environment, connect Temoa to one or more solvers, and then use the command line interface to actually run the model. So for those types of users who may want to just work off existing databases or run scenarios that are small changes to existing scenarios, or maybe add some new commodities to track, so like water or particulate matter, and look at environmental results, we offer this different option. So we're developing a cloud-based interface that can allow users to simply, upload a database file and run a scenario. So this, this interface allows users to interact with the input as well as the output data, as well as the model, and also provides some very basic visualization capability. So we think that this approach may also help with improving model accessibility and making it more accessible to a larger community of users. And then finally, we're also building a toolbox of methods that can account for uncertainty in model inputs and how that might impact, or how they might impact model insights. So for example, as part of Temoa, we've developed methods to do Monte Carlo simulations, as well as modeling to generate alternatives. And then Pyomo also offers the capability to do stochastic optimization. So the approach that we end up selecting will really depend on the question we're trying to answer. But this is just to say that we have a whole host of methods that we can use to account for uncertainty. And finally, just some insights from working collaboratively. So I mentioned, we have the core team at NC State and Carnegie Mellon, and we work with the larger project team of about 35 or so people across several universities and research institutions. These teams are organized by energy sector. For example, we have an industrial sector team, or as well as a transport sector team. And these teams are also organized by topic. So we have an uncertainty team and a policy team separately. So our expert team provide insights on, modeling and data, as well as thinking about sort of research questions of interest. We think this, collaborative approach could be valuable in several ways. For example, energy system model has become more familiar with tools and data within specific sectors, while domain experts in those specific sectors can see how their insights and assumptions play out within a larger system boundary or within longer timescales, for example. And here's a specific example of how we're leveraging insights from some of the domain experts in our project team. So, for example, temporal resolution remains a challenge in our modeling framework. So we need to represent energy demand and supply out to 2050, while also considering, intra-annual dynamics at the hourly level. The resolution that we had previously within the model, we had 12 representative time slices to represent an entire year. That resolution was quite coarse, especially when considering scenarios that see high renewables penetration. So the electric sector team pushed for higher temporal resolution. So we now use methods that are being used in capacity expansion modeling for power systems. So, we take a year's worth of hourly data, in this case, solar PV capacity factors for the northeastern US, and then we use clustering methods to select 4 representative days at an hourly resolution, which we can then use as input to our model. Going from 12 time slices to 4 representative days hourly, obviously, led to increased computational times, especially when we were solving the model in perfect foresight mode, where we consider all of the energy supply and demand out to 2050 within a single solve. So to address that, we developed this myopic formulation where we solve a smaller number of time periods at once, and then we kind of march forward to solve all the time periods sequentially. So this essentially frees up some computational effort during each solve. And it also allows us now to explore and solve versions of the data set that have higher spatial and temporal resolution. So these are just some examples of how we've leveraged insights from domain experts in our modeling effort. So to wrap things up, our plan is to release the first report for our project in March or April next year. So we're working on the input database at this time, and we plan to spend most of the fall and winter doing scenario and uncertainty analysis. So if any of this is of interest, or you'd like to know more about our work, or thinking about potential collaborations, please do reach out. There's a lot of contact information here. And I thank you for your time.
Okay, and we're back. And here's Aranya. So Aranya, thank you for that talk. What I would suggest is we can do a couple minutes of questions, anything immediate following that presentation, but then we'll have time to regroup also at the end after our next speaker as part of our longer panel discussion. But if there are any questions, you're welcome again to put them in the question box and we can put them up, or if you want to join one of the podiums, please go ahead and do that. You can ask your question orally. Or any comments as well. Questions, comments, again, I'm happy to have this relatively informal discussion like. Or I'll seed it while we're waiting, while people are thinking. But Aranya, so the 9-region model that's already built, is that already available to the public, or is it the GitHub repository still being constructed? When is that going to be available for people to start using?
So the GitHub repository is already available in public. We have preliminary representations of the database up at this point. So, it's usable, but there's lots of representations that we're still working on. For example, the industrial sector needs a lot of work, but it's still usable. And in fact, it has been used as a starting point for other projects that are doing similar analyses for other regions too.
Cool. And I see that. I just want to follow up really quickly because I was going to ask you about that as well in terms of the adaptability of the framework to other regions. Presumably, there's a lot of inspiration one can draw from the way you've put it together. Is the skeleton of the code and the framework actually directly adaptable to other regions with new inputs?
Yeah.
So the TMOA model, the modeling framework itself is basically just a framework. It's a bunch of equations, and you create input databases that are specific to the regions that you're interested in analyzing. So, for example, we're working with a couple of graduate students who are developing similar models for East Africa. So, that's another application. Other researchers have published some work looking at Puerto Rico. Is an example, looking at South Sudan. So there are existing examples of several regions that have been analyzed using just the TMOA framework.
Cool, thanks. And so there's a question on the screen from Sandy. I guess I probably don't need to read it, or well, no. Why don't I do that in case anyone's just listening in? So, I wonder if you've looked at the SciTS for Open Energy Outlook Teamwork, the science of team science listserv, and then there's a link.
Oh, that's great. No, we haven't, or at least I haven't, but that's definitely something we'd like to follow up on. Thank you for sharing it.
Hey, Sam.
Hey, Sam.
I don't think we can hear you, Sam. Aranya, are you hearing him? I am not.
No, not yet.
Sorry, Sam. I'll ask one more then, well, hopefully Sam gets it sorted. Which, I mean, would you be able to talk through, like, you said you have like 30,000 processes modeled, which, I mean, tremendous effort, obviously. Can you talk us through what does it look like to model one of those processes? Like, what's inside an individual model there?
So, typically, to characterize a single process, you need to first have data on the efficiencies of conversion processes. So, for example, if you're trying to model a power plant, we use some kind of average representation of the heat rate in there. You need associated costs, variable costs, fixed, maintenance costs, things like that. If we're talking about the power sector specifically, you might want to include things like ramp rates of the power plants and such, or any other physical constraints, associated with the system. We also explicitly model demands. In all of these different sectors. So that's that ends up being a good bit of effort as well.
And the demand is bottom up, or is it sort of an aggregate number with like some kind of elasticity associated with it?
So at this point, they're just exogenous inputs in the model, and we derive that from other modeling efforts that have focused on kind of developing demand data sets specifically. We do have versions of the model that can consider elasticity, but we haven't used it yet as part of our framework here.
Cool. Sam, you're back.
Yeah.
I can hear you. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for your talk, Aranya. You mentioned, I guess in the coming months, you'll be working on some scenarios and uncertainty analysis. I was wondering if you could kind of give us a sneak peek at some of the scenarios that you're kind of thinking about using this model to investigate.
Yeah, I think we've had sort of very preliminary discussions about that. And I will, maybe sort of offline, I can send you a link to our roadmap document, which actually contains some of the details of these research questions at a pretty high level. But kind of specifically, we're definitely thinking about net zero type scenarios, looking at different trajectories to low emission standards. We've also been thinking about policies that are specific to some of the individual sectors. So thinking about, just transportation sector policies in isolation and how that might impact kind of energy-wide, system changes, really, those sorts of policy changes. We're also thinking about sort of other environmental indicators. We don't have a lot of data on this yet, but we're thinking about, maybe constraints on water and how that might impact the energy system. So I think that's sort of longer term, but certainly of interest, and maybe of more interest to folks here as well, kind of working on similar themes.
Great, thanks.
That's a quick overview, but happy to talk.
Yeah, no, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, I'll give it one more. Oh, okay, there's one more. I was going to say, let's take any questions that are currently queued up. And once we clear those, then we'll move on to our next speaker and we'll loop back. So we have another question, which is, thanks for the presentation. I understood the uniqueness of the Open Energy Outlook is the open source nature and its peer-reviewed framework. Are there other merits compared to other macro system outlooks?
I think those two are definitely, ones we wanted to highlight as part of this effort. I think one of the other advantages that we've seen is that, again, the ability to link some of our work to similar analyses in other regions. I think to your point earlier, Daniel, we've seen, we've kind of started collaborations with sort of several folks who are doing analyses in different regions, and we're able to kind of learn and grow from each other, which I think is somewhat unique to this, but probably it's seen in other efforts as well. And yeah, I think with some of these tools, just the ability to kind of get more real-term feedback. If someone has questions about a specific assumption, you can always dig in, a little more easily and say, hey, why are you assuming this versus something else? I think that the ability to kind of adapt quickly is something that we appreciate as part of this framework.
Okay, great. So let's pause that there. But again, Aranya, we'll be back to the panel at the end. We'll have more time to chat. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker. And then I guess we can pull Paul up onto the podium while I'm doing that. So our next speaker is going to be talking about integrated assessment modeling is Dr. Paul Kishimoto, a research scholar in the Energy, Climate, and Environment Program at IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna, Austria. His research advances open methods and community data for assessment of global transport systems and options for reaching climate-neutral, sustainable mobility, in the future. Paul studied at Engineering Systems and Technology and Policy at MIT and serves as a contributing author to the IPCC, chair of the Climate Change Subcommittee of the Transportation Research Board, and co-organizer of the International Transport Energy Modeling (ITEM) Consortium. So, Paul, why don't you give a quick intro to yourself, additional intro to yourself, and then we'll go ahead to the video.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Daniel. I'm not going to say much at all. I'm eager to get to the discussion after the talk. Only to say I have a lot of notes. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to, while the video is playing, go and dump into the chat some of those links. The first one will be to the slides, and you can click from the slides, but I'll also repaste some of the links into the chat so you can follow those. And very happy to take your questions during and after about any of these items. That's all. Thanks. Hello, and thank you for listening to this talk on effective strategies for multi-sectoral research using large-scale models. My name is Paul Kishimoto. So this will be a bit of an unusual talk. I'm going to go straight from some very high-level concepts and meta-concepts about research design, and then jump right down into some quotidian, everyday practices for how we build and use models. And in fact, I'm not actually going to promote any particular study at all. Rather, I'm going to focus on these details of model construction, model use, and hopefully introduce some things that will be useful to you. My feeling, and that one that I hope that you'll share by the end of the talk, is that these things are an important perspective and an important toolkit for model-based sustainability research. So to motivate, when we're pursuing climate change mitigation and the other SDGs, this entails making changes in systems of systems that we might say are complex, large, interconnected, open, and socio-technical, per the framing of Sussman and others. In order to study these systems, we use quantitative computer models. And in particular, the changes that have to occur in these systems trouble or problematize the boundaries between sectors of human or economic activity in two ways. First, changes in one sector might be large enough that feedbacks from other sectors are really non-negligible and have to be included, represented explicitly. Secondly, we're actually designing and deliberately introducing new technologies which are intended to establish new interactions across these sectoral boundaries. So one example is the use of electric vehicles and their batteries to provide storage and frequency control on the electricity grid. So in this context, we're motivated and called to connect sets of models, by which I mean two or more models, or to increase complexity in existing models representing those systems and subsystems in order to study changes in those multiple subsystems at once. So the first concept I'd like to introduce is validity, and I really like this framing that splits into internal and external validity. Internal validity is simply the idea that research is free of error. It correctly implements the theory that we intend to implement, addresses confounding variables, and allows us to reject alternative hypotheses. External validity, in contrast, is the idea that research is generalizable to other conditions. The research can be replicated or reproduced in different contexts. It's robust to differences between the study context and others to which we might want to apply its conclusions. And it's also robust to uncertainty, or, for instance, plausible alternatives to some key assumptions. Next, I want to give you 3 perspectives or ways of looking at what a model is that are all true simultaneously, and they give us different insights. The first, a model is a knowledge object. It embodies or represents a theory or understanding about some phenomenon in the real world. Those theories are often causal, and we often express them quantitatively as equations connecting variables representing concepts measured in certain systematic ways. In the large-scale integrated assessment models that I often work with, these systematized concepts are often aggregates, so the GDP of an entire country, the emissions from an entire sector. A model is also a scientific instrument, like a microscope. It's used to perform experiments, and the experiments are of this nature. What would be the outcome or the effect on some quantity y if x were changed from some value x1 to another value x2? Of course, we're not going to actually go out into the world and delete instantly all of the coal power plants, but we do this in the model, and then we expect the changes in y in the model to tell us something about what might happen in the real world. Another notable instrument is the Large Hadron Collider, and this one, of course, was enormously expensive, cost €7.5 billion to build, and importantly, it was built of components, and the individual components were for preparing the experiment, running it, measuring outcomes, and each of them was carefully designed, constructed, and individually tested before being integrated. So this instrument requires meticulous attention to detail, and importantly, the description of methods includes description of the instrument so the experiment can be reproduced. Finally, and this is the one that might be new to some, a model is a software project, and by a software project we mean people in organizations creating code that is run on computer systems. And of course, academic and sustainability research are not the only places in which this happens, so from all those other experiences, we know that all software has bugs. All organizations have politics, by which I mean power relationships and hierarchy. We know that software is constantly evolving and never complete. There's a tendency to overinvest time in new code, and there's this phenomenon of technical debt, wherein code that is not maintained eventually grows out of sync with its dependencies, other things that it's supposed to interoperate with, data, and eventually becomes unusable. But the good news, put positively, is that there is a body of knowledge of good software development practice. This exists, and it's widely used, again, outside of research and academia, to ensure that software meets needs. So we can learn things from looking at that. Returning to validity, let me talk again about external validity. Because the model is not the real world, or the map is not the territory, it's crucial that implications that we draw from modeling are externally valid. Otherwise, we can't say anything about, say, policy implications. And there are threats to that external validity. I pose these here as forms of uncertainty, and to respond to each of these kinds of uncertainty, there's different tactics that we employ in our model-based research using a model, or how we construct the model. So as one example, epistemic uncertainty is when certain future conditions are unknowable or the uncertainty cannot be quantified. And so we respond to that by modeling alternate scenarios. And there are other approaches like sensitivity analysis, large ensembles, and testing alternate formulations that are used for the other types of uncertainty. The crucial point here is that all of these approaches or responses require a quality instrument, one that can be reused in an easy, automated manner and give the same results every time. In other words, a reproducible model. So you may be familiar with this FAIR or OFAIR rubric for open science. The last 4 are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And we focus on the last 2. What I'd like us to be skeptical about, often, always, is are those things true in principle or in practice? So I think it's very easy to claim that others could, in principle, reuse elements of a model-based research workflow that we've just tossed into the supplementary information with something that we've published. It's much, much harder to make this achievable in actual practice. For instance, feasible with the resources of another modeling team or even a new master's student. And what's worse, even that achievable reproduction is not true reusability. That's a higher bar. I won't go on about this, only want to say that equity and inclusion require that analytical tools and capabilities that allow us to analyze and chart our paths towards global sustainability be broadly distributed and used by all. It's not adequate that researchers from low and middle income countries get to come and join well-resourced incumbent modeling teams if these teams still remain central and indispensable. And finally, the urgency of climate change and the other SDGs really requires that we bring more people to participate in this work. So we want to lower the barriers to doing so and not make it too hard for others to participate in model-based research. The last framing concept I want to give to you is about cost and resources. So we have finite resources. We have time, energy, money, etc., with which to conduct these research. And the work that we do, especially creating and using models, should spend those resources efficiently. And there's a variety of tasks that can be very costly. I pose these as answering questions. So for instance, if a student created some model variant or some slight improvement in the model 2 years ago, and we want to locate, resurrect, and reuse and reproduce that analysis and use it as the basis for more work, that can be very, very time consuming. So none of this is new. I think it's important to note that. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. We are privileged to be able to stand on the shoulders of giants. In particular, the quantitative social sciences, such as psychology, have had a reproducibility crisis over the past 10 years, and their responses to that are very interesting to study as an example. In computing, as the notion of it being fundamental to valid research, I think climate science is probably the best example. They've been subject to very intense criticism, some would say too intense, over a long period of time, and they've responded in a truly admirable way. So at this point, one can raise questions about some of these forms of uncertainty and how well we can know the actual state of the climate system or its true dynamics. But one cannot say that the software that implements that knowledge has any faults, because it's been very carefully developed. And of course, again, the practices that we're going to talk about here are from software industries with minor adjustments. In fact, this stuff is so not new. There's already an XKCD comic about it, and I'd invite you to study this one on your own time. So, practices for model-based research. I'm going to give you examples from MessageIX Globium. So this is our family, not a single model, but a family of global and single country models and model variants built in a particular framework called MessageIX, which is a generalized linear programming optimization formulation for an energy economic or integrated assessment model. The links here, the first is the documentation, docs.messageix.org, and the second, github.com/yasa/message_ix. That is the open source code, and I will paste these links in the chat so that you all have them along with the slides. Some caveats here. Of course, we aren't perfectly au fait ourselves. This talk reflects a mix of our current practices and our goals, but we do celebrate continual and incremental progress on all of these practices and the efforts of others to improve, which is why it's so nice to be hearing the talk of Aranya in this session. The strategies and practices at the highest level, you start not with the the technical practices, but you start with organization and culture. And in particular, you should discuss and identify in your team where your resources are spent. What are the costly modeling tasks that really are sapping those resources? Look for possible improvements in practice that can, eliminate those costs, and agree amongst yourselves that there is a positive return on investment for time spent implementing those practice improvements. This is non-trivial, but once you've achieved this agreement, genuine agreement within your team, then you can start to make progress on implementing these. The practices, I would say, are a collection of interlinked and mutually reinforcing ones. To paraphrase Fermat, a truly remarkable variety that these slides are too few to contain. They can be adopted separately and again incrementally, but they really start to show their value once they reinforce one another. And Finally, there are corresponding skills, so the knowledge and know-how of your team members to do these things is a thing that is worth developing, so they need to be supported in spending time on doing that. So I split these into practices for model-based research and then some more advanced practices built on the first set for multi-sectoral research in particular. The basics: use version control, read documentation, write documentation. There's really no debate possible on these points. Some additions that I would add to the basic directives: it's generally better to collect code into fewer, larger, better organized repositories, and this follows the principle that with many eyes, all bugs are shallow. You should learn and use the GitHub workflow. It does work quite well for academic work, and it will save you a lot of confusion and time resolving parallel streams of work on your modeling tools. For documentation, the key point here, the number one audience for the documentation is you or your closest collaborators. So be kind to your future self and save yourself some time, a month, 6 months, or a year down the road trying to figure out what you wrote some code to do. There are some other approaches like pair programming, rubber duck debugging, and I'd also advise you to use services like Read the Docs, one of many automation tools. And what this one does is it builds and publishes HTML documentations as a web page every time you make a change to the code that is stored in version control in a GitHub repository. Second, write modular code and write it for reuse. It is still common, unfortunately, to have a large variety of tasks combined in a single long script or a couple of scripts, and I've listed a few there. What you should instead do, and do from the start, is to separate concerns. So each code object, function, or class should do one thing and one thing only, and you can group those objects into files for related tasks. Don't repeat yourself. It's much better to write one function and use it in 10 places. If you write similar code 10 times, statistically, at least one of those times you're going to make an error, and that error is going to threaten the internal validity of your modeling research. So don't give yourself the opportunity to make that error. Write smaller and atomic functions. They're easier to understand, easier to document, easier to validate. And often you can go and find, once you've decomposed your work into these smaller atomic functions, that others have written higher quality and better performing ones. They're available in popular public libraries, and you can simply discard these extra code and have less to maintain yourself. And finally, one last benefit of modularity is that new data methods, etc., can be easily swapped in. This is not possible when bits of your code are too tightly glued to the other, like pieces of say, a grilled cheese sandwich. Third, write tests for internal validity. So software tests are essentially code, more code, that runs your primary or other code, and they give a pass or a fail result for a specific experiment or test. So in this example here, suppose that part of my core model and core methods is this function compute vehicle stock, and it takes in some dummy data. It might read some other files, and it's expected to give us this particular result, 42.1. And by running this test, if that something has changed that function, something has changed other functions that it calls, the libraries that it depends on have been updated or altered in some way, we're going to get a different result. Observed will not equal expected, and this test will fail. So this is, because this is code that implements the core theory and methods, this is a check of internal validity. And you could imagine checking the same function for a lot of boundary conditions and behaviors that you might expect those theory and methods to reflect. In MessageIX, we have hundreds of such tests from the basic to the complex. And again, this saves us a lot of work of wondering, imagining, or manually checking whether changes and adjustments and improvements we're making in the code are disturbing or invalidating some existing part of the code. We simply run all those tests at once and then confirm that they've all passed, or if one or two have failed, then we are directed where to focus our attention and to improve our new additions. Fourth, automate. And this builds very closely on the previous item of writing tests. In software, this is called continuous integration. And what these services do is they watch a code repository, they grab new versions automatically, and they perform certain actions, such as running a test suite. And this becomes valuable once tests cover all the core methods in your model. As I said, CI reduces work to guard against invalidity or what's called regressions in the software world. So not only do all of those hundreds of tests get run simultaneously, I don't even have to run them manually. I simply push my code and the system takes care of telling me whether I've broken something or not. Next, when the code includes all steps in a model-based analysis, the CI system can continuously confirm reproducibility. And I give a link here that you can follow and peruse to a tutorial notebook from MessageIX. Basically, this code constructs and solves a simple energy system model, and every time the code is modified, we confirm that this still will work and produce the same results. So, moving on to some more advanced JAS practices for multi-sector research. These are built on and sort of elaborations of the prior four that I shared with you. There's two, and they're a little bit more complex, which I'll explain at a slightly higher level. So the first is to separate model building components. That is, separate code that prepares a base or a simple model from code that adds or alters detail and resolution related to a particular phenomenon or a particular sector. So I draw this as puzzle pieces. You can say this puzzle piece is an instance of the base global MessageIX Globian model. And then we have this additional piece of code that sets up or adds transport sector detail. So when we plug them together, we get a global model with all of the base contents, and then we add transport sector resolution. For instance, disaggregating light-duty vehicles according to technology type, internal combustion, electric, fuel cell, and so on. So each of these pieces in our workflow, and possibly in yours, is under continual development by overlapping or possibly even entirely separate teams of researchers. And what that could entail is frequent and laborious adjustments to ensure these pieces, again, of our own work, not saying nothing about other people's work, just remain interoperable with one another. But modularity, as I described just earlier, and testing as well, when combined, they ensure that the shape of the piece, which is a metaphor for the structure and the data of the model that is prepared by that code, remains stable. So what that means is the base global model, as long as it continues to have the same interface and pass the same tests, it continues to present the same shape. And likewise, the code that configures the transport variant, as long as it continues to pass the same tests, it will work on anything that has this shape. So having those two things for those two separate model building components ensures that they can be combined and they will produce a jointly valid model combination with additional detail. And of course, that's just the one-to-one example. When we apply this and we have model variants, as we do for materials, residential energy use, water energy land nexus, etc., the same approach ensures that we can plug these together and, in a sense, compose models with the details required for particular studies. And again, as long as they satisfy these shapes that are required by others, we can even possibly do this in different orders, and the testing allows us to redo this from scratch every time the code is changed and confirm that it works. And I've linked to where we do this in our MessageIX models package. Last point, use precise metrology, and this is the study of measurement, not meteorology. And the key thing here is to separate data flows and specify them separately from methods. So when you have your core model or analysis, there are independent variables, line 2 or stage 2, and its immediate dependent variables or outputs at stage 3. So you can describe those, you can describe the structure of those data, and then you can separately describe at stage 1 the data that is taken in by any input data processing and methods and aggregation, derivations, etc., to make available data ready for the core model, and similarly for the output data processing on the other side. So the flows across these 4 lines are kind of another interface, and being clear about what those are, in addition to clarity about the methods, also helps towards interoperability. At each of those stages or interfaces, you can be precise about background versus systematized concepts, specific measures, precise about which dimensions data have, which specific codes or labels are used to represent along each dimension. You can be precise about units of measurement. Another point that I really need to emphasize, don't invent new data formats. please reuse existing formats, reuse existing protocols, existing codes and labels. I've linked some good ones there. The people who have created these are better programmers and computer scientists than you or I. They've done better work, and it's just an opportunity to, again, waste our resources and probably invent something inferior, a little square wheel, if you will. So to conclude, I want to go back to costs. Some costs I didn't mention earlier are the costs of disobeying incentives. So incentives that we might face or face very excruciatingly as model builders and users to publish only work that can be labeled as novel in some way, to publish it only when it's final, not when it's in progress, to signal compliance with disciplinary norms like OFAIR, but actually put minimal effort into genuinely implementing them, to assist only collaborators and not provide any support to other users, or to not budget for maintenance and support, and to value sort of impressive polish, GUIs, or ease of taking first steps with the model over more mundane efforts to ensure validation, repeated validation, and reducing the costs of interoperability and reusability. If we look at the free software world, outside of science, outside of research, we know that it succeeds when communities work together to build and collaborate on a smaller number of higher quality projects that are, in a very real sense, public goods. It succeeds when innovation is planned and done out in the open, and when support, documentation, and enabling the contributions of others is first class and highly valued work. So with that perspective, the idea of open science as producing free software is actually very revolutionary. It entails a dramatic change in norms and changing the incentives, setting up new incentives for ourselves, simply not the same activities shared ex post. So thank you for your attention. The slides which you will have access to have the references, and the code for these slides is also online.
All right, that was great. Thank you, Paul. So I think it offers sort of a nice complement to what we heard from Aranya. I think we're going to open up some extra podiums as well. So as before, please feel free to type your questions into the chat or the question box, or if anyone would like to join the podium. I will kick it off while people are thinking about their questions. So Paul, one of the things that we've struggled with in my research group is sort of thinking through that there are some very good researchers who are not very good coders. And I'm curious if you've had occasion to sort of split those tasks, right? Have you worked with people who know the content, working with professional coders separately? Do all the researchers these days with these large models have to become coders? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's a really good point. I think everybody can target incremental improvements and what such improvements as they can make in the time that they can devote to improving their coding skills. We have been lucky in our team here to bring in people who do have sort of software backgrounds, or people with a mixed software and research background, but give them a job responsibility, which is basically just to work on the code and to support people who are driving particular research projects. But I recognize that's only possible in larger teams, and it's actually taken us a lot of internal debate and that cultural change to make that happen. Another thing that makes it really difficult is that I referenced the software industry. Somebody who's a computer science grad can go out and make six figures in North America straight out of their undergrad, and that's not what we pay people in academia. So we really have to find people who are motivated by the opportunity to make a contribution to the world or something. It's not really a great way to recruit and retain people, unfortunately. So it's a problem we still grapple with, but definitely an important one to be thinking about.
Cool, thanks. And we have a question from Sandy. So any connection to Karl Popper's Austria scientific method in favor of empirical falsification?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Popper is a foundational figure in the theory of the philosophy of science. I think we are sometimes drawn to produce reports, produce inputs to policy and so on, and not to undermine ourselves by going and looking for invalidity or questioning the work. So it's good to do that and to value that when we are doing it and when others are doing it.
So I do have some questions for the group, for the audience, but let's take another couple moments if there are other questions for Paul, or if you want to look back, questions for Aranya, or comments as well, also welcome. And again, you can use the chat.
I actually have a question for Aranya, if I could.
Please go ahead.
So I love that you guys are using Binder to share notebooks with people. One problem that we've had is sometimes people go through the initial tutorials and that we've tried to make the barrier to entry low there, but then they sort of hit an inflection point in the learning curve where they've gotten that far, but actually maybe their just domain knowledge or their computing knowledge doesn't allow them to take the next step that they imagine, and there's a little bit of disillusionment. So I was just wondering, is that something that you guys have also run into, and how do you respond to that?
So not yet. I think some of this notebook development.
Pause for 1 second. Paul, we're getting a bit of an echo. If you could just mute when you're not talking, that would be great. Thanks. Sorry, Aranya, go ahead.
Is this any better?
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks. So yeah, the notebook development work has been sort of quite recent, and so we haven't. Yeah, I don't think we've worked as yet with a set of users that aren't familiar with kind of how notebooks works, or even how some of these large optimization models work. But I will say that in other instances, so for example, we have a Google groups that we've set up for Timoa specifically. So on that platform, we get a lot of questions about hey, we've reached this point and we've run these simple tests, and now we're developing our own sort of larger models, and we've run into issues. So I would think using that kind of platform or similar platforms would probably address some of the issues that you're seeing specifically with notebooks too, and something that probably we should think about for our set of documentation notebooks as well in the future.
Yeah, I'd like to follow on from that for both of you, actually. I mean, one of the stories that I've heard over and over again are people who are really interested in using these macro imaging models or an IAM, and just the barrier to entry seems huge, right? Sort of figuring out how the model works and getting it to run. I mean, I've actually heard of users from one integrated assessment model who gave up trying to use another one. So people who actually know what they're doing and couldn't get it to. I mean, I guess you have any advice, either advice for people trying to chip into this, or thoughts for the community to make this better. I mean, as someone who wants to sit down and use a macro energy model, use an IAM, who's never done it before, can that actually happen, or is the barrier just too high?
Sure, I'll go first. Yeah, so one of the things that we've added to our documentation, and I just pasted in the chat, is we have a page on prerequisite knowledge and skills. And so we want to be very upfront with people and say, look, you need to know a little bit about optimization. You need to understand certain energy system concepts. You need to have these computing abilities. If you don't have them, you're probably going to run out of rope pretty soon. And then we also provide learning materials, so people can go and invest and help each other learn those things, and then when they're ready, actually start using the tool. Right? So we want to be very upfront and transparent about that. The other thing is that because this framework has been around a little bit longer, we do run capacity development workshops with the EASA national member organizations every half year, and we really very carefully listen to the struggles and difficulties that those successive groups of new users have getting up to speed. And then we go back to our documentation and we say, okay, how can we better explain how to use this and what it's doing and how to use it for different purposes. And I think that's a very different activity from writing an academic publication that describes a certain analysis or that describes the theory and conceptual methods. It's more about guiding people through the practice. But I think every time we invest in doing that, it does end up being worthwhile, and it helps somebody down the road.
That's great.
I think those are great points, and certainly something that we'd like to sort of implement as we continue development work. One thing that I want to add to the discussion is that often I've seen some of these tools that are open source in the tools but not in the data. So for example, you can access some of these very large models, and they say, here's all the code, do what you want with it. But I think it's also particularly useful to have some examples of data sets that are also open, that can be combined, and that gives a better starting point for people who are perhaps a bit more unfamiliar with the domain itself or with modeling. And then better tutorials. I think whether using notebooks or maybe doing sort of better videos to actually explain some of the steps involved, and then having some kind of forums where you can ask some of these questions to the user community. I think that also helps. I think for us at least, it's kind of evolving. We've seen similar efforts, in other open source models as well. For example, those listed on the Open Mod initiative, for example. But I think it's growing, and it's an exciting time to be part of the community.
Great. Lynn, could we actually put up a thing? Can I do another yes/no poll? Is that going to be possible? Or do you need more notice than I just gave you? Awesome. So I'd like to hear from the audience. So how many folks in the audience now have either used or attempted to use a macro energy model or an integrated assessment model as an outside user, right? As someone not part of the development team? All right, that's 4%. Quick mental math. That sounds like probably one person in the audience. I don't know who you are. If you're willing to self-identify, would you mind jumping on the podium and tell us a bit about your experience and any barriers you faced doing so? I'll give it 10 seconds, and if you don't want to self-identify, that's okay. Or if you're willing to share even in the chat as well. Okay, for everyone else, has anyone had interest in doing so and got intimidated away or faced other barriers where they didn't even try? I'd be curious to hear as well. And again, chat or podium. Here we've got an answer from Scott. Oh, didn't have a chance to reply. Sorry, Scott, I'm too fast. Well, Scott, we'd love to hear from you. Are you willing to jump on the podium? I haven't tried. Now I'm getting confused. Was I too fast, or was Scott saying he was going to try in between me asking the question? Anyhow, whoever jumped on, I saw someone jumping on. Please go ahead. Again, this is always tough in these online settings, but I really am keen to hear from the audience and have this not just be a one-way. So Scott, you haven't tried. Did you want to? Is there a reason you haven't?
I knew you were going to force me into doing this.
I'm sorry.
Hey, everybody. Hey, Aranya. The session's been great. I just wanted to make sure I started with it. I feel like I'm on like a radio talk show. Long time listener, first time caller. But no, seriously, the session has been great so far. All I was trying to say, Daniel, was that, with respect to the poll and what you asked about trying to be a user of models like this, I guess you could say at a very high level, as a faculty member in a former life, I did try to get involved with these, but it wasn't me, right? It was like, hey, Aranya, go learn how to do this. Hey, Daniel, learn how to do this. So my answer to this poll question was no. I can report secondhand from such people that all of the frustrations that the panelists were talking about were relayed weekly to me. But and again, I think the whole goal and purpose of trying to try to do these in open source, accessible ways, including with tutorials and other things are being mentioned, still has to be done, right? We can't just sort of say no one else is gonna try to do these things. No one else is gonna try to make Tomoa or build Tomoa, and so let's just build it for ourselves and not worry about it. That defeats the purpose. Even if there only ends up being a small community of users, 25. Which I would argue is not that small, you still have to push doing it, and you still have to do your best and elicit feedback. A lot of those big, you were talking about macro models. I'm assuming you mean Markal, NEMS, et cetera. And doing those, I don't really get the sense they want to get the input, and I don't really get the sense that they want people to tell them what is wrong with them, and probably don't have much incentive to change them because people have been using them forever. So I will stop and listen, as they say on the radio.
No, thanks, and I'll echo that. I've had a similar experience, right? So, as a faculty member, I sort of wish I had learned to do this as a PhD student. I didn't, and so now if I ask my students to go learn, it's very hard for me to support them because I don't know how these things work, and so that even just where to start has been a big challenge for me.
Well, let me just be clear. The mistake is trying to spend the time in your current job going back and learning how to use those models. That's probably not what you want to be doing.
And yet
Yeah,
they're very useful.
I mentioned reproducibility in practice, and I said there's the theory that an entire modeling team. So we're Message. If we think about GCAM at PNNL, maybe the GCAM team with several people could reproduce one of our message analyses. Could a new master student do it? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Right. I think one other response is that I work with a large scale model. Aranya works with a large scale model. I think a lot of this discussion is also germane to a single piece of analytical code that's produced for a single paper. So I've gone and looked at some of the publications that were referenced in the earlier sessions of this conference, and some people do include in their SI, here's a Zenodo link, here's my R script, and so on. And I tried to download and run one of them. I won't say who. Didn't work. And I think that's actually a better place to start for most people, and it's more realistic for new grad students, is to say, just take some small analysis where the body of code or the tool or whatever that's being used is very simple, and try to replicate that. Probably still they won't be able to, but that gives lessons to that person about, oh, okay, well, if I don't want to present these barriers to somebody else in the future, here's how I should do it differently in my own work. And doing that in an individual small, master's, first PhD project builds, that practice and know-how to do it in much larger teams.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Paul, Aranya, I mean, do you think there would ever be a case for structuring these things as like a service offering, right? Where, again, the problem is there's this push to novelty, right? Everyone's trying to do novel new work, and no one wants to just do service to help other people do their work. And I know, Paul, you mentioned that actually is, some of the documentation, some of the failures are only supporting your collaborators. I mean, I could envision a model. I could envision a way of working where there would be people on staff, some of these large teams whose entire job is sort of fee for service, help other researchers use the tool.
I mean, I think that's a great point, and I think it lends itself well to some of the, some frameworks that have kind of large institutions supporting it, right? But for at least, kind of the frameworks that I'm working with are a bit smaller and newer. Funding is actually an issue that we need to think about, right? So, what are some of the ideas that are actually going to be funded? Is it kind of the service aspect of things, or is it the research aspect of things? And so finding a good way to kind of balance that ends up being a priority for us, which may not be the case. Maybe Paul, can comment on that a bit more.
100% co-sign, that's all I'll say.
Scott, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I think Aranya has said it at a high level, and maybe I'll say a little more explicit level so people get the point. Going back in time, right? People were paid to develop the original models, right? Including the ones that are being talked about now. The contracts to make models typically is not a perpetual agreement to support it, answer all questions, etc. So it is not a surprise that the weaknesses that we are all reflecting on in the widely used macroeconomic models that are out there exist, because they're largely done by consulting type operations, and there's not a lot of incentive for them to bring along the next generation of people, and that's a reality financially. The unfortunate side effect is there is a generation of potential people who come along, you mentioned master students, who decide they want to understand how energy modeling works and immediately go, holy cow, the way we model energy is so ridiculously complicated that I will probably never understand it. So I'm going to go take a class on electricity transmission instead, right? No, but I mean, it's like, it's a hopelessly high bar to come along and try to learn one of these things, even if you have the intention and desire to pursue that as a career path. And effectively, the complexity closes that door, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, that's a good point. I saw there was a comment from Cindy about having had interest and tried, but again, it's expensive and time-consuming to understand these models. It's a real challenge. I sort of feel like we don't quite have a solution. We're just pointing out the problems. But why don't I go down the list if we had some pre-prepared questions? For anyone in the audience who has themselves tried to connect two models, let's say, even if you're not jumping into one of these pre-existing models, if maybe two models from your own research group, can you talk a little bit about any challenges you've found there, just interconnecting even small scale models, or what was the most time consuming? Has anyone had that experience? I'll start to answer the question. This is a question that was provided by the speaker, so it's not my own question, so I don't feel as bad answering it. We've had this in my group as well, where it's the interoperability. It's the fact that these things are often bodged together. If you don't know the word bodged, the great British term of sort of code that was never really meant to go anywhere else. And even if it's a relatively simple model, anyone else stepping in to try and look at the code, it's a real problem. And if you don't have the original developer there anymore, so in terms of what's been the most costly, often it's even just whoever's doing the work figuring out the two simple models. At least that's been my experience. Let alone then trying to actually make them talk to each other. I'll give it another second in case anyone else in the group wants to add to that.
Maybe Daniel, question back for you. You think using something like version control and GitHub, do you think that might help with this partially with the problem, or do you think it's more, there are other sort of underlying issues?
I think version control helps. I think the incentives aren't there to document properly, to make things right. It's again this idea of this. You're being funded to develop the tool and answer some research questions with it, and often not being funded to make the tool such that it can be reused. And so I really don't know how you overcome that problem. And again, internally, we have students who are working on these tools, or even postdocs. They're trying to graduate. They're trying to move on to other jobs. And properly documenting or properly coding for reusability can sometimes be at odds with getting that next paper out. And so there's a misalignment of incentives, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think sort of more recently, at least in some of the proposals that I've been involved in, I've seen more of a push to actually encode that into the proposal, deliverable itself. And so you have funding aside to actually make this a bit more transparent and accessible, and all of that. So
yeah, well, and I'd love to see funding agencies push for that, right? There's been a big push in recent years. You must think about EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, in your proposal. Why not? You must think about documentation and longevity. And it's a little bit lip service. But there's a question, and I'd love to say your name, but I'm probably going to butcher it. Opioloa. You can, if you want to jump on the podium, you can tell me what I've done wrong. But I wish models were thought of as recipes. Once one ingredient or step is missed, it means every trial will go to naught. What are your thoughts on presenting models as recipes?
That's a really great metaphor, I think. And so in my talk, I said modularize and separate concerns. It's exactly the same thing, right? So to mix the eggs, you have a stand mixer. That's one piece that you use with some ingredients to do one step of your recipe. And then you have a frying pan. You fry the eggs with some additional ingredients, some milk, and that's how you get your omelet out, right? So the point is that you separate those pieces of equipment. You don't try to have one piece of equipment that is both your stand mixer and your stove and your frying pan, but you very carefully distinguish them, and you list those ingredients and clearly show how they work together. So some of the diagrams that, for instance, Aranya showed, we have similar diagrams. They talk about the conceptual structure of the real world system that we're representing in a model. But it's also good to have diagrams, flow diagrams of this is how we get from data and we run it through this step, we run it through this step, we run it through this step, and out the end, we get an object, a collection of data, something in our Python or our program that is the model that we can then run, right? So those sort of descriptions of the model building process are super, super valuable. And again, when we invest time in building those recipes in your metaphor, and we give them to new colleagues, they often say, oh, this has really helped me understand what this huge assemblage of machinery is doing. So it's a great metaphor. I really like it.
I'll just add to that. Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense, right? And often when we present research results, right, here's the model and here's a description, or here's what we came to. The whole iterative process is totally lost in the publication, right? It's very much here's the endpoint, and how you got there is at best sort of there's a fake description in your methods, but it's really not what you really did to get there. Aranya, I don't know if you wanted to add to that. Otherwise, I'll go to Micah, who's jumped on stage. Thanks, Micah. You good, Aranya?
Go right ahead. Yeah.
The idea of recipes kind of reminded me of something that I had to address. I did my PhD work in synthetic chemistry, where literally when you report the prep of a compound, you're reporting a recipe that has to be reproducible that someone can follow. I now study energy systems at the Institute for Data Systems and Society at MIT. I build models to study, technological change and energy storage systems. And so I know that I've actually tried to write parts of my SI like a recipe, like the methods that I used in chemistry for many years when writing up like how I treated certain data. But I have found as though, and so when I'm training students, master's students often, who want to work with some of these models, I have to kind of draw a distinction between what I call research code and then what I call more professional code. And so like when you make a compound for the first time in the lab, it's often a messy process. Like you don't know that ethyl acetate or acetone will be a better solvent. So you might add ethyl acetate, notice that nothing's dissolving, evaporate it, remove it with a rotovap, and then add acetone and then try again. And you kind of work through that prep. And I think one thing that we find is that when we write code, you're like, oh, it would be great to add this functionality. Let me just put everything in a for loop, right? And then just have it go through. And so research code is built up that way. And there are no incentives to go back and clean it up. It's only when I use a piece of code maybe 4 times when I'm like, maybe I should pull this out into its own function. Sorry, I refer to it as functional programming as opposed to modular programming. But I didn't really think about that until a physicist came and we had a conversation. He's like, I use functional programming. I'm like, that's a great idea. I think there is a distinction to be made between research code, which you're kind of building as you kind of figure out what questions are important, because you don't always go into one of these projects knowing which questions are important. And then there is no incentive to then improve that code to the point where it is reproducible, because the journals don't require it. The funders certainly aren't funding it, at least as far as my experience goes, which is limited. I'm a postdoc. And so that's what I've run into when I've inherited code from others. It was research code. But by calling it research code, I try to give it the benefit of the doubt. The people who were building it were trying really hard to think of the questions. And so, yeah, it's complicated. Yeah, it's messy. Yeah, you need to look at it really carefully to look for bugs. But it reflects the learning process that they were undergoing in their research. And to bring it back to recipes, when you publish a prep of a compound, that's probably the 3rd or 4th time that someone made that compound, if they were being a responsible chemist and testing it a few times.
I think that's a great insight there, and I completely agree. We've only got about 2 minutes. Maybe I'll just follow up with Paul and Aranya. So this idea of this research code versus professional code. So it sounds like there's a push here with both message and with the open energy outlook to make these professional code. Would you agree with that, or would you say it's somewhere in between? Can you just maybe, as a sort of almost closing thought?
Yeah, I can go first. I think that's like the end goal. I mean, we'd love to be able to do that, and I think at least with Kimoa, the model itself, the way we've been able to do it is kind of stage interventions, and at certain points in time, we come in and try to clean up the code and make it sort of more presentable. And maybe that's an approach kind of iteratively that we can use going forward here as well.
Yeah, we try to be really clear with ourselves about which bits are research and which bits are our say infrastructure. So for instance, we do have code which is like a recipe, which is just like set up and run some scenario, but we do have other code where that's the centrifuge, right? It's the thing that you're using to mix the components or something, and that has to work all the time flawlessly. And we designate that and we treat that stuff differently than we treat the research code. So I think that's the same thing. Like I think those core methods, they have to be treated like something that must never fail. And then what you do with it, the sort of speculative analysis, that can be done in a little bit more of a messy way.
All right. I've really enjoyed this session. This is something I've been wanting to discuss for a long time. I think there's a lot more still to discuss. Paul, Aranya, any closing thoughts, parting words of wisdom? I mean, thank you both for being here. I think this has been great.
Well, thanks for having us. And this is a way to kind of get more feedback from folks here. So we'd love to hear more from you all.
Yeah, I just say start small, spend a little time, realize you're saving time, keep doing it.
Awesome. Well, thank you to the participants, and I'll see you, I guess, at the poster session next.